The Boeing 737 cruised at 37,000 feet, its passengers lost in the hum of pressurized air and the glow of seatback screens. In 23A, a woman sat with her eyes closed, headphones in, fingers drumming against the armrest in a pattern that wasn't quite random. She wore jeans and a faded gray hoodie, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. To the businessman in 23B, she was invisible. To the flight attendant passing with the beverage cart, she was just another tired traveler. But in the cockpit, 2,000 feet above the Atlantic, something was happening that would change everything. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom, measured but carrying an edge that made passengers look up from their magazines. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor technical issue. Nothing to be concerned about, but we'll be making an unscheduled landing in Halifax. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin. The words were calm, rehearsed, but in the flight deck, Morrison's hands were trembling. The hydraulic pressure gauge had dropped to zero. The backup system wasn't responding. They had maybe 40 minutes before the aircraft became unflyable. Halifax Center, Delta 742, declaring emergency, Morrison transmitted, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. Total hydraulic failure, requesting priority landing. The response came quick and professional, but Morrison barely heard it. He was running through procedures, calculating fuel burn, trying to remember if he'd ever actually practiced this scenario outside of a simulator. His first officer, a sharp 28-year-old named Keating, was already pulling up emergency checklists on the digital display. Neither man noticed when the flight attendant, Sarah Chen, appeared at the cockpit door, her face pale. "Captain, there's a passenger," she began, then stopped, choosing her words carefully. "She says she can help." Morrison didn't look up. "Tell her to return to her seat and fasten her seatbelt." "Sir, she says she's—" Chen hesitated, glancing at the note in her hand. "She says she's a pilot, military, and she knows this aircraft." That got Morrison's attention. He turned, irritation flashing across his face. "Ma'am, we appreciate the concern, but we're trained professionals. Please return to—" "Captain," Chen interrupted, something urgent in her tone. "She wrote down her credentials. She says to tell you she flew the EA-18G. She says to tell you her call sign was Viper." The cockpit went silent except for the steady drone of the engines. Keating looked up from his checklist, his eyes widening. Morrison's hand froze on the throttle. "Viper," he repeated slowly. Chen nodded. "She said you'd know the name." Morrison and Keating exchanged a look that contained a lifetime of military aviation culture, of legends whispered in ready rooms and bars near naval air stations. Everyone knew that call sign. Everyone knew the story, or thought they did. But the woman they'd heard about was supposed to be gone, discharged years ago, vanished into civilian life. Morrison's voice was different when he spoke again, quieter, almost reverent. "Send her up." The woman from 23A appeared in the cockpit doorway 30 seconds later. She moved with an economy of motion that suggested muscle memory, her eyes scanning the instrument panel before she even introduced herself. Up close, Morrison could see the fine lines around her eyes, the small scar above her left eyebrow, the way her shoulders carried themselves with a stillness that only came from years in high-stress environments. "Captain Raven Marlowe," she said simply, not offering a hand. "Retired. I flew Growlers out of Whidbey Island for 9 years. Before that, Super Hornets in the Gulf." Her eyes locked onto the hydraulic gauge. "You've got a dual system failure. How long ago did it start?" Morrison found himself answering before he'd consciously decided to. 6 minutes. We've lost all 3 systems. The backup won't engage." Marlowe nodded, her expression unchanging. She wasn't here to take command, wasn't trying to undermine him. She was simply present, offering her expertise the way a surgeon might offer to assist in an emergency. "I've brought planes down with no hydraulics," she said quietly. "Different airframes, but same principles. You're going to need to use differential thrust and pitch trim. It's delicate. It's going to feel wrong, but it works." Keating spoke up, his voice skeptical. With all due respect, ma'am, the 737 isn't a fighter jet. The control surfaces are designed differently, I know, Marlowe interrupted gently. But the physics don't care about design intent. When United 232 went down in Sioux City, they kept it airborne for 44 minutes using only engine thrust. The DC-10 is bigger than this bird. It can be done. She paused, her eyes still on the instruments. I've also seen it done wrong. I've seen what happens when pilots don't commit to the technique, when they second-guess themselves halfway through. Morrison felt something in his chest loosen slightly. He didn't know if this woman could actually help them, didn't know if her military experience translated to this situation. But there was something in her voice, in the way she stood, that suggested she'd been in worse situations and walked away. What do you need from us? Time to think, Marlowe said. And your trust. She moved to stand behind the center console, her eyes now taking in the full picture. Airspeed, altitude, fuel, distance to Halifax, wind conditions. Her fingers didn't touch anything, but Morrison could see her mind working, running calculations, building a picture of what was about to happen. The radio crackled. Delta 742, Halifax Center. We have you on radar. Emergency equipment is standing by. Runway 32 is clear. Wind is 280 at 15, gusting to 22. Morrison acknowledged and looked back at Marlowe. She was nodding slowly, her eyes distant. That crosswind is going to be a problem, she said. But it's manageable. Captain, have you ever dead-sticked an aircraft? Only in the sim. Then you're about to get real-world experience. Her voice carried no judgment, no condescension. We're going to practice on the way down. Small inputs. You need to feel how she responds with no hydraulics before we commit to the approach. She finally looked at him directly. This is your aircraft, Captain. Your decision. But if you want my help, I need you to trust that I've done this before. Not in this plane, not in these conditions. But I've brought wounded birds home when everyone said it couldn't be done. Morrison studied her face. He'd been flying commercial for 15 years, had over 12,000 hours in the left seat. His pride wanted to dismiss her, to prove he could handle this himself. But his training, his instincts, told him something different. This woman wasn't offering to save them. She was offering to stand beside them while they saved themselves. There was a difference, and he respected it. Keating, he said, not taking his eyes off Marlowe. Make room. The first officer moved aside, and Marlowe stepped forward, positioning herself where she could see both pilots and all primary instruments. The aircraft descended through 30,000 feet, beginning its long, irreversible fall toward Halifax and whatever waited there. In the cabin behind them, 163 passengers sat in nervous silence, unaware that their fate now rested partially in the hands of a woman most of them hadn't noticed boarding, a ghost from a world they'd never understand, someone who'd been tested in ways they couldn't imagine and had chosen, on this random Friday afternoon, to step forward one more time. Marlowe's fingers finally touched something, the back of the captain's seat, steadying herself as the aircraft shuddered through light turbulence. Her voice was calm when she spoke again. Let's bring them home. Morrison adjusted his grip on the yoke, feeling its dead weight, the absence of the hydraulic assistance he'd relied on for 15 years. The aircraft felt heavy, unresponsive, like trying to steer a ship through mud. He reduced thrust on the right engine slightly, and the nose began to turn slowly, reluctantly. Too much, and they'd enter a spiral they couldn't recover from. Too little, and they'd miss the runway entirely. Good, Marlowe said quietly. You felt that response time. That's your new baseline. Everything is going to lag. Your inputs need to be ahead of where the aircraft is, not where it's going. Think of it like aiming at where the target will be, not where it is. The comparison made sense to Morrison in a way that surprised him. He'd never been military, had gone straight from flight school to regional carriers to the majors. But he'd hunted as a kid, understood leading a moving target. How much lead time are we talking? About 3 seconds on the turns, 5 on pitch changes. And once you start a maneuver, you're committed. There's no quick correction. If you overcook it, you ride it out and compensate on the next input. Keating was running through the emergency landing checklist, his voice steady but fast. Fuel dump. Morrison shook his head. Not enough time, will be heavy on touchdown. Which means longer rollout, Marlowe added. And with no brakes, you're going to need every foot of that runway. Halifax's runway 32 is 8,000 feet. In perfect conditions, this bird needs 5,500. You're going to use all 8, maybe more. There's grass and dirt past the threshold, Keating said, checking the airport diagram on his screen. About 300 feet before we hit the perimeter fence. Then we don't hit the perimeter fence, Morrison said simply. He keyed the radio. Halifax Center, Delta 742. Confirm we have the longest available runway and that all emergency equipment is positioned beyond the far threshold. Affirmative, Delta 742. Runway 32 is 11900 feet. All equipment standing by. We've also cleared the parallel taxiway in case you need it. Marlowe caught that detail, nodded approvingly. Good controllers, they're thinking ahead. She watched Morrison make another small thrust adjustment, saw the nose respond with agonizing slowness. You're getting it. The temptation is going to be to over-control, to get frustrated with how slow she responds. Don't. Every input you make is like dropping a stone in water. The ripples take time to reach the edges. The aircraft descended through 20,000 feet. Morrison could feel sweat running down his spine despite the air conditioning. His hands ached from gripping the yoke, trying to sense the aircraft through controls that gave him almost no feedback. This was flying in its most primitive form, connected to the machine not through sophisticated computers and hydraulic servos, but through raw engine thrust and the laws of physics. "Cabin crew, this is the captain," he said into the PA, his voice carrying a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "We'll be landing in approximately 15 minutes. Flight attendants, begin preparing the cabin for emergency landing. Passengers, please listen carefully to the safety briefing you're about to receive and follow all instructions exactly." Behind them in the cabin, controlled chaos was beginning. Passengers were calling loved ones, typing frantic text messages, some crying, others sitting in stunned silence. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, demonstrating the brace position, checking seat belts, removing loose items, their voices calm even as their hearts raced. In 23A, Marlowe's seat sat empty, her headphones still on the armrest, her book open to a page she'd never finish. She stood in the cockpit, her eyes moving between instruments, her mind somewhere else entirely. She was remembering another approach, years ago, in conditions far worse than these. She was remembering the sound of warning alarms, the smell of burning electronics, the absolute certainty that she wasn't going to make it. She'd been wrong then. She intended to be wrong now. "Talk me through the approach speeds," she said to Keating. "What does the book say for this weight?" "Final approach should be 148 knots. "Add 10, Marlowe said immediately. "You'll be mushing without flaps and you cannot afford to stall. The recovery would take altitude you don't have." Morrison processed this. 158 on final. That's going to make the landing roll even longer. "Yes, but you'll be alive to complain about it." Marlowe's voice held the faintest hint of dry humor. "The goal isn't a perfect landing. The goal is a survivable one. There's a difference." The aircraft passed through 15,000 feet. They were committed now, Halifax their only option. Morrison could see it on the navigation display, a small symbol that represented safety, or at least the possibility of it. The distance clicked down, 83 miles, 82, 81. "When we get to 10 miles out," Marlowe said, "I want you to make one practice turn. Just a gentle 20-degree bank to the left, hold it for 5 seconds, then roll level. We need to know how she's going to behave when you line up with the runway." Morrison nodded. The plan made sense. Better to discover any handling quirks when they still had altitude to recover. "Keating, give me the wind again." 280 at 15, gusting to 22, essentially a direct crosswind, which meant Morrison would need to crab the aircraft into the wind on approach, then at the last moment attempt to align it with the runway. In normal conditions with functioning hydraulics, this was a standard procedure. Now, it seemed nearly impossible. How do you make precise adjustments when every control input took 3 to 5 seconds to register? "We'll land in a crab if we have to," Marlowe said, reading his thoughts. "It's not pretty, but the gear can take it. What we cannot do is let a wing tip touch first. That will cartwheel this bird across the runway, and we'll all have a very bad day." The radio came alive with Halifax's tower frequency. "Delta 742, Halifax Tower. You're cleared for emergency landing runway 32. All traffic is holding clear. Winds now 290 at 17, gusting to 24. Visibility 10 miles, ceiling 8,000 broken." "At least the weather's cooperating," Keating muttered. Marlowe allowed herself a small smile. "I've landed in worse. So has this captain. Weather is the least of our problems right now." Morrison glanced at her briefly, then back to the instruments. "Where were you stationed?" he asked, his voice conversational despite the situation, perhaps needing to hear something normal, something human. "Last deployment was in the Arabian Gulf, flying E-18GS off the Roosevelt. Before that, Hornets in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria." She said it matter-of-factly, without pride or false modesty. "I did a lot of missions that didn't go as planned. Learned to adapt." "Why'd you get out?" There was a pause, brief but weighted. "That's a longer conversation than we have time for right now, Captain. But the short version is that sometimes the uniform doesn't fit anymore, even when you think it should." She shifted her stance slightly as the aircraft banked gently. 10 miles. Time for that practice turn." Morrison took a breath and reduced thrust on the left engine, increased it slightly on the right. The 737 began to roll, slowly, reluctantly, like a massive ship coming about. He counted in his head, 1001, 1002, watching the bank angle increase with painful slowness. At 20 degrees, he reversed the thrust differential. The roll continued for another 3 seconds before stopping, then gradually reversed as the aircraft sought to level itself. "That's your roll rate," Marlowe observed. "Roughly 5 seconds from input to result. Remember that. When you're turning to line up with the runway, you need to start rolling level 5 seconds before you reach the center line." Morrison's jaw was clenched so tight it ached. This was flying like he'd never experienced it, like the earliest pioneers who'd had nothing but wire and canvas and courage. He leveled the wings, feeling the aircraft settle into its descent, and allowed himself a moment to appreciate the absolute focus required. There was no autopilot to catch his mistakes, no flight computer to smooth his inputs. It was just him, this machine, and the physics that govern both. The runway at Halifax appeared on the horizon, a thin gray line against the green landscape. It looked impossibly small, impossibly far away. Morrison knew it was neither, but the optical illusion was still powerful. They were descending through 8,000 feet now, the ground rising to meet them with what felt like increasing speed. "Gear down?" Keating asked. Morrison looked at Marlowe. This was her expertise now. "Will it help or hurt?" "The drag will slow you, which normally you'd compensate for with power. But you need that power for control. Leave the gear up until you're absolutely committed to the landing, then drop it and accept whatever happens. The deceleration might actually help on the rollout." It was unorthodox, possibly dangerous, but Morrison understood the logic. "Gear stays up until 500 feet. Keating, make sure the passengers and crew know this is going to be different. No flaps, no spoilers on touchdown, gear down late. They need to brace harder and stay braced longer." Keating made the announcement, his voice carrying through the cabin with an authority that belied his age. In the passenger compartment, people tightened seatbelts, removed glasses, assumed the brace position. Some prayed. Others went silent, retreating into themselves. A few, scattered throughout the cabin, sat upright and calm, their eyes clear. They were the veterans, the ones who'd been in situations where death was a possibility, who'd made peace with it long ago. They would brace when told, would follow instructions, but they would not panic. Fear was a luxury they'd learned to live without. The aircraft descended through 5,000 feet. Halifax was no longer a distant line but a real place, details emerging, buildings, roads, the shimmer of water. The runway was dead ahead, slightly off to the right due to the crosswind. Morrison began a gentle turn to a line, remembering the lag, starting his roll out 5 seconds early just as Marlowe had instructed. The aircraft responded, slowly, reluctantly, but it responded. The nose began to swing, the runway centerline drifting into view. Morrison held his breath, made microscopic thrust adjustments, felt the machine fighting him and yielding at the same time. It was like wrestling something alive, something that didn't want to cooperate but could be convinced, coaxed, guided. "Beautiful," Marlowe whispered. "You're flying her, Captain. She's responding to you." 3,000 feet. The runway filled the windscreen now, its markings visible, the emergency vehicles clustered at the far end like small red and white toys. Morrison could see people on the ground, tiny figures watching, waiting. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He'd found something in the last 10 minutes, something he'd lost somewhere along the way in 15 years of automated flight. The pure connection between pilot and machine, the conversation that happened through throttles and control surfaces, through tiny inputs and patient responses. 2,000 feet, Keating called out. 158 knots on glide path. Gear down at 500, Morrison confirmed. His voice was steady now, all hesitation gone. He'd accepted what was about to happen, accepted that he couldn't control the outcome, only his response to it. The fear was still there, but it was distant, manageable, almost irrelevant. 1,000 feet. The runway was all that existed now, a gray path to safety or disaster, no middle ground. The crosswind pushed at the aircraft, trying to drift it left. Morrison compensated with thrust, felt the nose swing back, held it steady. The aircraft was crabbed 15 degrees into the wind, looking like it was pointed away from the runway even as it flew toward it. It felt wrong, looked wrong, every instinct screaming that this couldn't possibly work. "Trust it," Marlowe said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "I know it looks impossible, it's not." 500 feet. "Gear down," Morrison commanded. Keating hit the switch. There was a mechanical sound, a thunk as the landing gear dropped and locked, and suddenly the aircraft was decelerating, sinking faster. Morrison added thrust, felt the response lag, watched the runway rise to meet them faster than he'd anticipated. "You're high," Marlowe said, no alarm in her voice. "Let it come down, don't fight it." 200 feet. The runway threshold passed beneath them. Too high, Morrison thought. We're too high. But he didn't add power, didn't try to force anything. He let physics work, let gravity pull them down, trusted in the laws that had governed flight since the first bird spread its wings. 100 feet, 50, 20. The runway rushed up, the center line visible, the numbers painted on the asphalt sharp and clear. Morrison began to ease the nose up, infinitely gently, feeling for the ground effect, that cushion of air that would slow their descent in the last few feet. 10 feet 5-3. The main gear touched with a jolt that rattled every bolt in the airframe. Morrison slammed all 4 throttles to idle, felt the nose drop, pushed forward on the yoke to keep it from bouncing. The nose gear hit hard, compressing fully, and suddenly they were rolling, speeding down the runway at 160 with no brakes, no spoilers, no way to stop except friction, and whatever gravity could give them. "Reverse thrust," Keating asked, his voice tight. "Too asymmetric," Marlowe answered before Morrison could. "You'll spin. Let her roll." So they rolled. The 737 thundered down the runway, eating distance, every second feeling like forever. Morrison could see the far end approaching, the grass beyond, the dirt, the fence. They were going to overshoot. They were going to hit something, and it was going to hurt, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it except hold the aircraft straight and hope. 6,000 feet, 7,000, 8,000, the paved surface ended. They hit grass at 90 knots, the nose gear compressing again as it encountered the softer surface. The aircraft began to slow, finally, meaningfully. Morrison kept it straight, refused to let a wing drop, refused to let the nose turn. The grass became dirt. Chunks of earth flew past the windows. Somewhere in the cabin, people were screaming. But in the cockpit there was only focus, only the absolute concentration required to keep this machine tracking straight as it plowed through terrain it was never designed to encounter. 60 knots, 40, 20, 10. The 737 came to rest 90 feet from the perimeter fence. Its nose gear buried 6 inches in soft earth, its fuselage intact, all 163 souls aboard alive and uninjured. For a moment, no one in the cockpit moved. Then Morrison's hands began to shake, the adrenaline crash hitting him all at once. He sat back, breath coming in gasps, and looked at the woman who'd appeared from nowhere and helped save them all. Marlowe was already moving, checking the overhead panel, confirming fuel flow was off. Electrical systems were stable. She worked with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been through this before, who knew that the landing was only the beginning of the emergency, not the end. "Fire crew is on the way," she said calmly. "Keating, announce the evacuation. Captain, you should." Morrison interrupted her. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, not with anger but with genuine wonder. "I mean, I know your name, I know your call sign, but who are you really? What did you do to earn that call sign? Why did everyone in the military world seem to know it?" Marlowe paused, her hand on the door. Outside, emergency vehicles were surrounding the aircraft, foam being sprayed, evacuation slides deploying. "That," she said quietly, "is a story for another time. Right now, we have passengers to evacuate." But Morrison had seen something in her eyes in that moment, something old and haunted and fierce. This woman had stories, had history, had demons she carried with the same quiet competence with which she just helped land a crippled airliner. The call sign wasn't just a nickname. It was a legend, a warning, a promise. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Morrison realized he'd just witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a successful emergency landing, but the re-emergence of someone who'd disappeared from view, someone who'd been hiding in plain sight, waiting for a moment when her particular skills would be needed one more time. The evacuation proceeded smoothly. Passengers stumbled down the slides, some crying, some laughing with relief, all alive. Morrison was the last to leave the cockpit, following protocol, ensuring no one was left behind. He emerged to find Marlowe standing apart from the crowd, arms crossed, watching the chaos with the detached observation of someone who'd seen worse and walked away. He approached her, still shaking, still processing what had just happened. "Thank you," he said simply. "We wouldn't have made it without you." Marlowe looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time he saw her smile. It was small, sad, and knowing. "You would have figured it out, Captain. You're better than you think, but you're welcome." She turned to walk away, toward the terminal building already visible in the distance, apparently content to simply disappear back into whatever civilian life she'd built. Morrison called after her, "Viper, the name, why Viper? What did you do?" She stopped, didn't turn around, her voice carrying back to him on the wind. "I struck when no one saw me coming," she said, "and I never missed." Then she was gone, walking across the tarmac, just another passenger heading for customs and baggage claim, leaving Morrison standing beside a battered 737 with more questions than answers and the absolute certainty that he'd just met someone genuinely extraordinary. In the terminal, news crews were already setting up. The story would break within the hour. Heroic pilots land plane with no hydraulics, all passengers safe. Morrison's name would be in headlines. Keating would be interviewed. The airline would issue statements about training and safety protocols. But one name wouldn't appear in any of the reports. One person would slip away unnoticed, declining all interviews, refusing all recognition, disappearing into the crowd as if she'd never been there at all. Because that was what Viper did. That was who Raven Marlowe had always been. The silent professional, the one who did the job and walked away, who carried her legends and her scars with equal privacy, who helped when needed and vanished when the moment passed. And on a runway in Halifax, in the growing twilight, a Boeing 737 sat testament to a truth the military had known for years. When things went impossibly wrong, when all the rules failed and the manuals offered no answers, there was one person you wanted in your corner. You wanted Viper. Even if you had to find her sitting quietly in seat 23A, looking like she'd never flown anything more dangerous than a desk, carrying secrets and skills that most people couldn't imagine. The sun set over Halifax that evening, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Morrison sat in a quiet corner of the airport, giving his statement to investigators, knowing that the official report would never capture what really happened up there. Procedures would be analyzed, data would be reviewed, recommendations would be made. But the truth, the real truth, was simpler and more profound. Sometimes salvation comes from unexpected places, wears unexpected faces, and asks nothing in return except the chance to help one more time before disappearing back into the ordinary world. Raven Marlowe caught a connecting flight that night. She sat in seat 18F middle row, and when the flight attendant asked if she was comfortable, she smiled and said she was fine. The businessman next to her tried to make conversation about the incident at Halifax. Had she heard? And she nodded politely, said it sounded scary, and returned to her book. He never knew. None of them ever knew. That was exactly how she preferred it. Because Viper wasn't looking for recognition or glory or gratitude. She'd left that world behind years ago, had paid prices most people couldn't understand, had earned the right to anonymity and peace. If she chose to step forward in a moment of crisis, that was her choice. If she chose to fade away afterward, that was also her choice. And as her flight climbed into the night sky, headed wherever her journey took her next, Raven Marlowe closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She'd done her job. She'd brought them home. She'd remembered what it felt like to be needed, to be useful, to matter in a way that transcended civilian concerns and touched something primal and true. Then she let it go, released it into the past where it belonged, and returned to being just another passenger in just another seat, invisible and unremarkable, carrying within her all the fire and skill and courage that had once made her legendary, hidden now beneath the surface where only those who knew how to look would ever find it. The aircraft leveled at cruising altitude, the cabin lights dimmed, passengers dozed or watched movies or typed on laptops. In 18F, Viper opened her eyes briefly, glanced out the window at the stars burning cold and distant in the infinite dark, and thought about all the times she'd flown through those same stars in a different life, carrying different burdens, fighting different battles. She didn't miss it, not exactly, but she didn't regret it either. It had made her who she was, and who she was had saved 163 lives today, had given Morrison and Keating a story they'd tell for the rest of their careers, had proven that expertise and courage didn't retire just because the uniform came off. The skills remained, the knowledge remained, the will to act when action was needed remained. Everything else was just details. Raven closed her eyes again, let the drone of the engines lull her toward sleep, and smiled faintly in the darkness. Somewhere over the Atlantic, a woman who'd once been called Viper rested easy, knowing she'd answered the call one more time, knowing she'd walk away clean, knowing that if it happened again, if fate or chance or divine providence put her in position to help when others couldn't, she'd step forward without hesitation. Because that was who she was, not the call sign, not the legend, not the stories whispered in ready rooms. Just a pilot who'd learned her craft so thoroughly that it had become part of her soul, inseparable from her being, ready to emerge whenever circumstances demanded it. And sometimes, on random Friday afternoons, those circumstances arose. Sometimes, the quiet passenger in 23A turned out to be exactly what everyone needed. Sometimes, the universe arranged itself in ways that suggested something more than coincidence. Sometimes, heroes wore hoodies and jeans and sat unnoticed until the moment they were absolutely essential. The flight continued through the night, peaceful and uneventful, carrying its passengers toward morning and whatever awaited them there. While behind them, in Halifax, investigators puzzled over data logs and tried to understand how two pilots had done something that shouldn't have been possible. They would never find the answer in the data. The answer was in the cockpit that afternoon, standing behind the captain's seat, speaking calmly about lag times and thrust differentials, and the patience required to fly a broken bird home. The answer was in the quiet competence of someone who'd done harder things in worse circumstances and remembered every lesson learned. The answer was Viper, and Viper was already gone.